and we've had amazing first session with Frederiek as our keynote speaker. I'd like to thank Debesh, Professor Debesh from the University of Westminster, the Rafter Foundation, for collaborating and putting this on. This is a really important, crucial moment in the history of Kashmir as well. So we need to, I think about a lot of things at the moment, and to help us think about some of those things, we have two excellent panelists with us. So I'll just introduce them briefly and also say what it is that I've asked them to speak about. They'll be speaking for about maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes each, depending on how you go. And then we will make some points of connection between them and we'll open it up to the audience. So we have about an hour for this session. So Nazir has grown up in South Kashmir's Tral area. I'm just reading the biography, and I really like this biography because it says he grew up in a cluster of 30 villages among apple orchards, brooks, springs, and chinars. He has no memory of a charming landscape, but he only remembers a dark night when Indian soldiers brought a man in cities and blew him up into pieces near the chinar tree where he used to play with his friends. It really gives you a sense of what kind of events, in fact, bring people together to work on these issues. Omaid was started as a volunteer in 2011 with APDP, and he is now a project manager with APDP since 2016. Dr. Frederiek de Vlaming is a part of the law faculty at the University of Amsterdam. She's a criminologist specialized in international criminal law and transitional justice. She's the director of the War Reparations Center and of the Nuhanovic Foundation, which is a collective of international human rights lawyers. I hope that's correct. And I think the Nuhanovic Foundation and the War Reparations Center are really interesting. It's an interesting sort of partnership in that organization because they've actually helped support the legal strategy around Russell Tribunal in Palestine, for Palestine, and also around enforced disappearances in Bosnia. So that's some of the things I know that Frederiek has been working on, but also she's currently working with the Syrian Legal Network and also with Kurdish lawyers. So there's a lot of expertise in international human rights law and mechanisms that Frederiek brings. Now, what I've asked both speakers to do is just so that you have a sense of what they'll be speaking about. So for Omaid, I've asked what are the challenges of human rights work in Kashmir? How do human rights organizations fare currently in terms of, say, government regulations, for example? How has APDP been engaging in human rights work internationally, and what more could be done? And for Frederiek, the couple of questions I've put to her are what work has the Nuhanovic Foundation or the War Reparations Center been doing, and what are the challenges of human rights work internationally? And I'm hoping that there are points of connection between the two speakers and we can draw them out, but perhaps you can listen in for what points of connection, so we'll brainstorm together and have an interactive session after they speak. So we will first start with Omaid.
Thank you, Goldie. Before the topic given to me was challenges of human rights work in Kashmir, before I go there, I would like to draw your attention about the circumstances we live in Kashmir, like the environment we live. I don't know if you know, but Kashmir is right now one of the most militarized zones in the world. When you see the troop and civilian ratio, it is 7:1. 7 civilians and 1 army man or the state police, any agency associated with the state. In the rural areas, however, the militarization is so pervasive that after every 3 kilometers there is a military camp or a police camp. and in some areas it's more deeper. In the recent times, mostly in South Kashmir, it has been more and more military camps emerge and come up every week. The Indian forces and the police make regular raids around the village. So they call it strategic area domination. They come in their, either they walk through the village or they come in their heavily militarized vehicles, and basically trying to scare up people so that they don't speak up. Post 2016 uprising, when a militant commander was killed, there was a huge uprising in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And what they have started doing, because people are continuously protesting, what they have started doing is they enter the villages, the army men and the police, they enter the villages and beat up whoever comes up in front of them, and enter their homes, break things, break TVs or the refrigerators, whatever they find. So this is the level of militarization that we face, and on top of it, these forces are protected by several laws which actually gives them impunity. Some of the laws, some of the influence laws, Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which gives army the right to detain, to kill and to enter homes without any permission and without the fear of any persecution. Then there is another infamous law which the Amnesty International has called lawless law. It's called Public Safety Act, which gives the power to the state police, where they can arrest anyone without any charges, and they can arrest them up to a period of 2 years, and without the fear, they cannot access the courts in these rural. And when you see, I would not go into the domestic, whether it is against the Constitution of India, whether it's against the right to life, right to liberty. I won't go there, but it is also against the international laws, such as the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, ICCPR, and United Nations Convention Against Torture, International Law, and International Convention for Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearance. On top of it, I would also like to add, even though they feel protected by these laws, some people actually try to file FIRs, at least what Kavina ji earlier said, that at least to go through this process, at least to get documented. It is basically a fight. The Indian state wants us to forget, but we don't want to. We don't. As APDP's main work is about memory, how we remember people, and how we don't want. To forget people, to forget what he was like. And so in the early 90s, people started filing the FIRs, but they couldn't get much out of it. I will give a recent example where in Shopian district in South Kashmir, 3 civilians were killed, and the state government actually filed an FIR, against the police. But in only after 2 weeks, the FIR was thrown out by the Supreme Court, which said, if we continue filing a FIR against the army men, it will have an effect on the morale of the Indian army. So, and some people. After in 1996, the state government started a state human rights council, lots of people went there, they thought like they would get justice as Parvinaji also said that those were only the retired judges, and we didn't expect much from them. And also we have to understand the fact that SHRC is a government, semi-government body, which is the members of which are selected by the government after much scrutiny, and the funding of the SHRC is also provided by the state government. So usually they don't go against the government, and also SHRC is only a recommendatory body. And so in 2017 there was an election, and a guy was arrested. His name was Frederiek, and he was tied to a jeep and basically used as a human shield. And so there was a huge human trial in Kashmir and rest of the world. But SHRC gave a recommendation that this guy should be provided compensation of 10 lakhs. But the Indian central government actually intervened there, and they said, what are you doing? How can you pass a judgment? And they just dismissed the judgment. And this is true with every controversial judgments they pass, and especially related to the conflict-related, problems. Before I go further, I also want to point out how torture has been normalized in Kashmir context. My friend, who is a PhD student, she went to conduct an interview in Kupwara district, and she asked a woman a question. The question was like, were there instances? The first question she asked her, were there instances of physical violence, committed by anyone against her by the state police? And she said no. And then she said, where do the crackdowns? Crackdown is the cordon operations around, where the government forces enter the village, they cordon the village, and tell the male members of the families to come out in a ground and assemble there, and the females are kept behind. And she told her, do the crackdowns happen here? And she was like, yes, they do. They come here and beat us up, But somebody told her, but you just said that no physical, violence happens with you. So she was like, but वो तो होता है, this happens, This is so normal, So this is how, the violence has been normalized in Kashmir, and unless it's something, killings, or say in 2016 the pellet guns, only then things get noticed in Kashmir, when you go to the binaries, if the killings are too much, or if there is a new form of torture, the pellet guns or something else, then it gets attention. Otherwise, nothing gets noticed when it comes to Kashmir. And in these circumstances, the Kashmiri civil society had intervened. And in the early 1990s, there were few groups which actually tried to intervene and support the families of the victims of torture. And in that endeavor, Jammu and Kashmir Bar Council was one of the first organizations which actually tried to provide some sort of legal counseling, and they would go to meet the torture victims and help their families so that they could get their family members released. But the current president of Jammu and Kashmir Bar Association, Mia Tulkayu, he was attacked in 1995 and was severely injured. Similarly, there was a prominent human rights defender named Jalil Andarabi, who was killed in 1996. He was also part of the Bar Council, Jammu and Kashmir Bar Council. Then there were other organizations like JKCCS who also tried to provide legal support to the families of the victims of the torture, and they also document the cases, and they have come up with several reports on different forms of torture or the killings, and some of the important reports are alleged perpetrators and structure of violence. And I think it's important if you actually have a look at that. And one of the most early organizations which started working in Kashmir has been APDP. APDP, as Parveen ji already mentioned, informally it started in 1990s, but a formal shape was given it, and it was called Association of Parents of Disabled Persons in 1994. And with the help of a few lawyers and activists from all over Kashmir. APDP started with documenting of the cases, and Parveen ji actually went from village to village, because the problem was the victims and the family members were really scared of filing FIRs or going somewhere to ask for justice. So it is the work of Parveena Ahengar who actually went to these places, who actually went to all these, all the corners of Kashmir to actually bring them together so that, they form a collective which can collectively ask for justice. As I said, like APDP's work is mostly focused on the memory, where we want people to remember, where we don't want, state to let us forget the members of, the victims of torture, victims of enforced disappearance. We recently have also started post 2016. We started working also with victims of pellet guns, who, as you saw earlier, who have been, in most of the reports, according to most of the reports, more than 1,000 people have been injured in either of the eyes, and some people have been affected in both the eyes, and which has affected their livelihood, their education, as I told you about the memory work, this is one of the, how we wanted, so that, people don't forget it. We come up with a calendar every year, and we come up with 12 cases. So this is our third year of coming up with a calendar, and also posters which we send to different places and which we distribute all over. I also wanted to talk about how we mostly work. We gather on 10th of every month, where families of the victims of enforced disappearance come to a park which is near a press club, so that everybody can see. And we gather there. The families come and remember their members. Similarly, we also work on, there is a huge gathering on 30th August where artists of various forms, like singers, painters, they come and sing songs for the victims of enforced disappearance, or they paint whatever they find relevant at that moment. We have over the years also engaged with our main work is documentation of the cases, but over the years we have also engaged with the United Nations and different instruments of United Nations, where we, Parveena ji, went to attend a working group meeting on enforced or involuntary disappearance in 2008, where she submitted some cases, and we regularly submit cases to special procedures for enforced disappearance, and in 2011 and 2012, two special rapporteurs, one on human rights defenders, Margaret Sagakai, she came on 2011, and actually in 2012, Christopher Haynes on extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions, we hosted Christophans in Srinagar. And we have also engaged with the UPR process since 2000, since its inception in 2008, since the first UPR for India. We, in 2008 and 2012, we submitted the individual submissions, and in 2017, we were part of the UPR pre-sessions where we went to Geneva and we also made some submission. Yeah.
Thank you. I might ask you questions a bit later,
Yeah.
but I think I'll have Frederiek, Dr. Frederiek with Vlaming.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for your invitation to be here. I'm not an expert on Kashmir, not at all, but Goldie is slowly drawing me into this campaign, and I think it's worthwhile. What I will do is tell a little bit about the organization I work with and how we cooperate with the university. And I think two questions that were posed just before the break, I will touch upon that. And the first question was about what's the value of all those papers? And I think that's a very good question, because I think there's a huge value of papers and paperwork, and it becomes even more important now. The human rights movement is moving towards movements for accountability. And I would like to outline that development a little bit. And the other question was how to link up with the international community. And well, you're already giving the examples how you very effectively, I think, you do that. And I think you're doing a lot of good work in that field. But that's also one of our activities, how to link up local lawyers with international networks. To explain a little bit about the Nuhanovic Foundation, which is a Bosnian name. It was a name of someone, of a family who was killed during the Bosnian War in the early 90s. And the name stems from a case, a court case that was that started after the war. When it became clear that not only the war criminals were in Bosnia, but there was also some responsibility in the international community. And with this court case, lawyers connected to our foundation tried to establish the legal responsibility of countries that were involved in the war, not so much as parties, but as with a task to protect civilians, and didn't do their work very well, to see how we could legally define that responsibility. Well, that's a very technical legal question. If you want to know more about that, I'm very happy to elaborate on that. But in short, what we do is work with lawyers to see how we can litigate the rights of victims of war crimes. In doing that, over the past couple of years, we mainly worked with networks of lawyers. Goldie already mentioned that. We worked with, of the last 3 years, we worked with lawyers from Syria. And what we did was offer them an international network to bring their cases to international organizations such as the UN organizations that are in Geneva, but also to litigate their cases before domestic courts. For example, in the Netherlands and in Germany, in Belgium, Switzerland, you can bring a war crimes case, even though it happened far away in Syria or in Turkey. You can bring that before a national court. In Germany, it's called universal jurisdiction. You bring such a case to a court, even though the facts did not happen in Germany. The perpetrators are not in Germany, but the victims are there. Because, as you probably know, there are a lot of Syrian refugees based in Europe. And we support lawyers that start litigation before, for example, in this case, before German courts. We do that also in the Netherlands and in Belgium. We likewise we work with organizations of lawyers from Kurdistan, Turkish Kurdistan, where we link up with groups of lawyers who are spread out more and more, unfortunately, all over Europe, and assist them with working in the field of litigating the rights of war victims. By doing that, we link up a little bit to what is called in the academic literature the third wave of human rights work. And what do I mean with that? I already briefly mentioned that. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, when human rights became a mainstream activity, for example, in Latin American countries, it was very much work of civil society. Very comparable, what I understand is being done now in Kashmir. It's civil society fighting governments. That was actually the first wave of human rights work. The second wave was that, for example, to point again at that situation in Latin America, that when the undemocratic governments were replaced by democratic governments, those new governments took it upon themselves to work with civil society in monitoring, reporting, investigating human rights violations. So it became, human rights work became something together between civil society and domestic governments. This third wave, in which we are now, according to some theorists, is that the international community is more and more involved in the investigation and monitoring of human rights, but with a special emphasis on accountability. And that is something that is new, relatively new, and that stems from the fact that in the early 90s, the international community suddenly decided, the UN, to establish a tribunal, and that was a tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And that was a real legal revolution in the sense that for the first time, the United Nations sought to establish individual responsibility for human rights violations and international crimes. And at that time, for the first time in Geneva, a commission was established that was to assist this process. It was the Commission of Inquiry. Since then, we have more than 50 commissions of inquiry. I'm not sure actually whether there's a commission of inquiry for Kashmir.
Not sure.
Not sure. It's something we have to investigate. And that commission that came out of the human rights movement, but governmental and internationally governmental, was not just there to report on human rights violations, but to investigate those people that were behind human rights violations and war crimes. And that was something totally new. And I think that development, we are now in a situation where the international and national actors in the human rights movement work more and more towards that goal. Well, there are a number of, Goldie asked me to tell you a little bit about the challenges of the work nowadays. Well, there are many challenges, and we see that from the example of Kashmir. But one of the challenges in this respect is that there are differences in human rights reporting and investigating international crimes and war crimes, or international crimes against humanity and genocide, the three groups of international crimes. And the effort now, the challenge now, is that we bring the standards and the mechanisms and also the technology to bring those standards, to merge those standards together, that human rights reporting becomes fit, and that we can use human rights reporting also for mechanisms that establish individual responsibility. And that, I think, is a very interesting development, and I think the movement in Kashmir has done an enormous, important job by publishing this book on perpetrators, and I think that's an immense achievement if I compare that to your colleagues who are, for example, working in the Kurdish area in Turkey, who are not even near to being able to do such work. So I really have to compliment you on such a report, because I think that is hugely important. So in short, what we are, the emphasis much more on, if we talk about our organizations and the work at the university, is very technical legal work, but all aimed towards making it possible that whatever we report on and whatever we collect of information in the field of human rights violations will be one day be able to use in court. And that's why I think it's so important, the question on paperwork, that you collect all these things, because that is the evidence. And the evidence is not in your head, I mean it's in your heart and in your head, but a judge will, at the end of the day, will want to have the physical evidence. And that's why I think it's very useful to keep on collecting that, even though you think that's useless and the system doesn't take care of that. But it's the only thing you can do, and it's extremely important. So far, my little presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for speakers. Both of you have very articulately, both of you have been very articulate in actually talking about Kashmir and then the international human rights mechanisms and challenges. Obviously, personally, I don't think there is correct me if I'm wrong, anyone in the audience, but I don't think there is a commission on Kashmir as of yet. You've read the alleged perpetrators report for Frederiek. What do you think are the chances of something like that developing, say, an ICTK, ICT Kashmir, for example? Are there possibilities of that?
Well, it's not that, it doesn't depend on the report. I mean, you did your work, but it depends on the international political relations, and that's always the case. I mean, if you look at, you mentioned the International Criminal Court was mentioned, and what the International Criminal Court can do depends on politics, and that's, I mean, you can as a lawyer do your work, and you do that, but at the end of the day, we're stuck with international relations, and it's the same, for example, if you look at the case of Syria that I'm dealing with a lot. The only body that can do something about Syria is the United Nations Security Council, because the Security Council can refer the case of Syria to the International Criminal Court. Well, there is Russia and China in the Security Council, so it will not happen. So at the end of the day, it's the reform of the UN system that will make that happen, and I think we have to work on that level as well. But we're stuck. So it's not the report itself, but it is the we have to work in the international constellation.
I'd like to open it up to...
But maybe let me just, because that's a little bit of a doom. I mean, that's a doom answer. That is not a real. That doesn't give you any links. But I think. I think this commission that we call it, which is called in full the Commission of Inquiry, and in Yugoslavia was the first one in the early 90s, because of the war and because of there was a short period that Russia and the West could agree on things with each other. Because it was a miracle that the United Nations, the Security Council, decided that there was going to be a tribunal to establish individual responsibility. And it was just because there was a very short period that the international community agreed on something. The other reason why they could agree on this was because they thought this international tribunal would never be an institution with teeth. They all thought, well, we have to do something. We don't know what to do with this Bosnian war. Everybody's killing each other. They're only thugs there. All parties are equally wrong. We don't know what to do. So international community said, let's establish this tribunal. It was done overnight, and they really didn't know. They didn't realize what they were doing. And they didn't realize at that moment they were really triggering a revolution. Because from that moment, the International Criminal Court had not been there if there had not been a Yugoslavia tribunal. But that was because there was this short period that everybody could agree. Well, that situation now is really different. But still, a commission of inquiry as a sort of introduction to or a portal to the next step a tribunal or another mechanism might be something to fight for.
Absolutely. So, as I said, we'll open it to questions. I think Marion has
Sorry, just a quick question for you. You mentioned universal
Jurisdiction.
yeah, and I'm just wondering, realistically, how does that work? If the perpetrators are not in a state where the prosecution is taking place, what kind of verdicts, and does it have any teeth?
Right, yeah, well, that's a very good question. And you have different forms of universal jurisdiction. The one in Germany is, as I said, is pure universal jurisdiction. So what they do is they submit an application, a file or an application with the prosecutor in Germany and said, Mr. Assad is guilty of war crimes. They submit the file with all the papers and all the paperwork, and the prosecutor can receive the file, and there can be a court case, but of course it's purely symbolical. But that doesn't have to be a problem, because it is to the Syrians, it's a signal to Assad and a signal to the people in Syria saying, we're monitoring, we're looking at what you're doing. And it may be, at the end, there will be a verdict against Mr. Assad, because he will never come and visit Germany and have tea with Mrs. Merkel. But it is in the Netherlands, for example, we don't have that possibility. The perpetrator has to be in the Netherlands, and that's the same in Switzerland and Belgium, and I think Norway is an example, but maybe you can help me out here. In the Netherlands, we have the prosecutor is preparing a number of cases about war crimes in Syria, because the perpetrators are in the Netherlands. They came with the flow of refugees, and they were identified by other refugees. And they said, in our refugee camps, there are people who are war criminals. And so these are investigated, and that is real, because then if it's being investigated now by our police and prosecutors, and if they can find enough evidence, again, based on paperwork, the people can be prosecuted, and so that is real. Then you have, and that again is also that gives a lot of redress for victims. Say, well, it stands trial. We're there. We can come and give evidence, and it's a sign to people in Syria: don't come to Europe because you can be tried here.
Are there any questions, Igor?
Well, maybe an obvious question, but there are differences between Syria that might dissolve, or circumstances in Yugoslavia where the state dissolved and the remaining or successor states were small and dependent on recognition and cooperation with more prosperous and larger states in Europe. It's not quite like that with India, at least not in the foreseeable future, and I guess we'll hope it stays that way. So, in the imagined case that violators who are Indian citizens would be tried in a court of universal jurisdiction, then it would be a goal, I assume, to make the local politicians, first of all, of course, the politicians in the state where the court takes place, to draw some political conclusions of such a legal verdict, and we should work to secure that. It's an interesting case here relating to Norway, where the then Minister of Justice traveled to Sudan to negotiate possible return of migrants or refugees with a head of state that was accused of war crimes, right? And internationally sought for war crimes, and he might have been tried in a Dutch court or at least the German court. It's troubling when we have politicians that do not or treat legal verdicts of this kind as negotiable or as just an opinion, basically, a political opinion presented by lawyers. What can we do to make this work stick better politically? There's no real chance that we can capture that back.
I'm not sure what your question is.
Well, I mean, this is a political use of the legal system, right?
No, I would not say it. That's not. I mean, crimes have been committed. You can also say it's not a political system. Crimes have been committed.
I don't mean that in a negative sense, but I mean, we would want to make it as politically effective as possible. We expect our politicians to respect the verdicts of the legal system, right?
Yes.
In all cases. And they should in such cases as well. We should give this as much political power as possible, but it's difficult.
Well, but, yeah, I'm still not sure what you're aiming at, but my guess would be stay as much as possible out of politics to make a legal route as effective as possible. But I don't know whether I'm touching on your concern here.
I guess the problem is to have the legal authorities in a state like India or Russia or the United States accept the jurisdiction and take consequences from such verdicts is pipe dreaming very far into the future.
Of course, no, but are you talking about the impact of such cases?
I'm talking about
right.
the impact of the verdicts, right?
Yeah.
Not the proceedings themselves.
You mean the impact if you have a court case, for example, here in the UK, which very often happens, by the way. The UK lawyers are very active in monitoring potential war criminals who enter the UK and warning the prosecutor's office here. I think not so long ago there was a Nepalese army officer who was arrested when he came in, also for torture and war crimes. I don't know the details about the case, but as a legal team you can be very attentive and see who's coming into your country. And there are a number of categories of crimes, such as torture, that where a country, where someone who has tortured comes in, has the obligation, has a legal obligation to prosecute or send someone back, hand them back to its own authorities. So yeah, but what the political impact is of a court case, that's in every case that's different, of course. And you can have a setback. Sometimes we advise people not to go to court because it may have a negative impact on your negotiations at home. I mean, that's an ongoing debate. If you are, for example, if you're involved in peace negotiations, and again, for example, the example of Syria, you're involved with Mr. Assad in peace negotiations, and at the same time you say, but as soon as you are ready with the negotiations, we go and get you. Then that will ruin your peace negotiations. And that is always, wherever you are, is always a problem. And you have to be very careful in deciding what route you will take.
I'm now full of hope. There's a lot of people coming through the UK at the moment. I'm not naming names.
You should name names. It's the only way to go.
But we have a question from the gentleman.
Yeah, I think regarding the commissions of inquiry, I do not think there has been any official commission of inquiry, although I think Omar Abdullah, when he was not the Chief Minister, spoke about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission many years ago. But I'm also a bit pessimistic about those commissions of inquiry, and I was thinking that would that institutional mechanism not privilege peace over truth by screening certain truths from public knowledge for the sake of formal? And therefore, should the truth teller engage with these institutional mechanisms or continue to sort of resist these institutional mechanisms, because these are, in a way, a biopolitical technique to tame the subject. So unless and until the terms of those commissions change, I do not think that the truth teller should engage with the institutional mechanism of engaging with the sovereign. And therefore, I think these papers are so important because these papers build on the archive. An archive that Theresa May has been destroying with the Windrush generation, so that there is no trace for them. So these papers do help in not only memorializing the one who has disappeared or the one who is buried in those mass graves, but also to dupe the state, to challenge the state on a regular basis. So my larger question is, what purpose would these institutional mechanisms serve? Because they are, in a way, to make the subject more manageable, which sort of they are not.
Well, the commission that we're discussing, the Commission of Inquiry, is an international UN commission. I mean, it's not a national commission. And what I've seen how these commissions work, I mean, they all work differently, is that they aim at collecting as much as information as possible in order to establish accountability. And so, you have to, I mean, of course, it's still UN, and UN is also desperately politicized. Of course, it's a collection of countries, or of states. So you should never be naive, but I think it's one of the best mechanisms to be able to collect information that finally and one day hopefully will lead to establishing responsibility of states and of states, institutions or private persons. I see now from very near how the Commission of Inquiry for Syria works, and that is, I'm impressed, and also, that makes me very hopeful, because that is about people who go out, look for people who have become victims, spend days and weeks and months putting on paper what has happened, and store them at the UN Geneva office. It's true, but they also report that to the United Nations Security Council. And of course, as long as the relations there are sour, to say the least, there's not much hope that something good will happen with them. But that's the only thing you can do. And I've seen in this case how satisfying it is for victims to share your story, and I'm sure that is Pravina's experience as well, to share your story with someone in the UN that says, give me your story, because that's also sharing responsibility. Give me your story, we have it here in Geneva, and everybody can have a look at it, and everybody can share it again. And I mean, even though that's so poor, given the misery that's there, but that is already one step. And I think we should encourage the UN to continue and stuff it with information, and give it as much paperwork as possible, and talk to them, and don't stop doing that. It's the only thing we have. I mean, thank God we have a UN.
It's interesting that you mentioned truth and reconciliation, which Umar Abdullah tried to talk about. It was basically about, forgiving and forgetting, and not talking about the resolution actually. The resolution which people are actually fighting for, people who died on the streets, who were killed over the period of 30 years. They fought for some cause. And Umar Abdullah was saying that let's forget and forgive and move on, which the Kashmiris were not ready to listen to. And I must also add, why the focus has been more on the documentation of the cases, and Pravina ji repeatedly says in various talks, she says, after I die, what then? That's why we have to do this documentation, so that at least it speaks for us, who fought for the victims of torture or victims of enforced disappearance. And it's, as I told you earlier, it is about remembering people.
So my question is for Matt. So, you talk about your memories of the conflict and how it affected your life. So my question is that have you done any work on the lives of the women and children whose parents have you done any work, or what are the sufferings of the women or the children whose husbands or father are victims of enforced disappearance? So how they manage to live without them, and how they survive, and what are the things that they face on daily basis, and what are their struggles? Because the person who is disappeared, the person is suffering in the torture cells or wherever, but the family of the victims, how they are surviving, especially their wives or the half widows and the children. So if you can tell.
It's interesting that you asked me this question. So the first time I started volunteering for APDP, and the first case, the first victim, the family member of the victim I went to is called Safiya Azad, and we were talking, and at the end I told her, I didn't know this was the first time talking to any person, who has been directly affected by this. So I told her, do you still have hope? It has been 20 years. She was, at that time when her husband was taken away, she was 20 years old and her son was 6 months old. And she answered, and she told me, what, after the mobile phones came, the landlines were taken away, they were stopped by most of the Kashmiris. But she has still kept that landline, because she said, he only remembers this number. And she told me that, my son Dawood, there is no tradition, we don't celebrate birthdays as such. But for 20 years, she has celebrated her son's birthday and clicked a photograph. And, so that when he comes back, so he sees how he has grown up. For every year, she has taken a photograph on his birthday. So they are still waiting. They don't want to accept that maybe something. They don't want to accept that. There is another family I recently visited. Her name is Jamila, and her only son was taken away. And she told me, I told her, one of the guys I was assisting. So he told her, do you think he's dead? So she was like, he comes to my dreams, so I don't think he's died yet. If he would have died, he would have stopped coming to my dream. So they still have a hope, they are still alive, and they are still waiting.
So if you can tell for others how society supports them, and especially for women, and is it any difficulty for them? So what are their daily life struggle living in a society conflict is everywhere. So as a woman, so do their families are supportive, who support them? And
in most of the cases, yes. Yes, in most of the cases, the families support them. That's why they have come up, up to this day. But in many families where we have to intervene, basically because he was the only member who was earning, so then we have to intervene. APDP intervenes in such a way. Maybe some people need medical support, or the children, we support education of the children of victims of unlawful disappearance. And we also support, in some cases, the livelihood, help them set up a small shop or a kitchen garden so that they can continue with their livelihood.
I think we have pretty much, we're sort of toward the end. We may have one last question if anyone wants to ask. Yes.
Hi, my name is Half Kashmiri. I'm originally from Indian occupied Kashmir. I have two questions actually. The first question is, in 1990, 50 women were raped by Indian Army in Kunan and Bhojpura. 6 victims has been died yet. And one of the incident, obviously the girl shared her story. Do you remember Kunan Bhojpura? And she said, I was raped by 10 army soldiers and they raped me in turns. So do you expect, so 30 years almost gone here, so justice, obviously they didn't get any kind of justice. Will you expect, obviously, from the Indian government, they're going to give any kind of justice to the people of Kashmir? This is the first question. And the second question is, do we have any kind of policy, I need to ask this question to the brother here. So do we have any kind of policy in Kashmir so we can bring the international community, obviously they can raise obviously the voice for the people of Jammu and Kashmir?
I will answer the second question.
Yeah, second for you.
After the 2016 uprising, OHCHR, Office of the High Commissioner in Human Rights, they actually wanted to come to Kashmir and they asked both Indian side of the Kashmir and the Pakistani side of the Kashmir. They seek their permission so that they can enter and see for themselves what's going on there. But the Indian government didn't allow them to visit there. And it is true with every international body which wants to enter their working group against enforced and involuntary disappearance had asked India also to allow them access to Kashmir. They didn't allow them. And I think it's very difficult for the bigger bodies to visit because they don't allow them normally in there. And the first question.
But can I just add to what, because I thought you were mentioning that the special rapporteur came to Kashmir?
Yeah, the special rapporteur, it's very interesting when when Christophe came, she was given a 1-day deadline to come on the morning and leave in the evening. She was just there for a few hours. She was in a tight deadline that she had to enter Kashmir in a single day and come back to Delhi. Enter and come back in a single day.
And sorry, can I just, did that have specific repercussions on your work?
At that time, no. It happened in 2011 and post 2016 it has been very difficult.
The first question, do you think the Indian government, I think, is that a rhetorical question?
It sounds like it.
Omaid, I think your answer.
I think you talked about Kunan Pushkara. Recently, a group of 50 women from all over Kashmir actually filed a petition in Jammu and Kashmir High Court. And the case is still there, but there has been no outcome.
So I think on that note, it's funny when you say no outcome, and I'm going to say actually both of you have talked about hope, right? In very sort of dispiriting and demoralizing circumstances, you've still spoken of hope. And one of the things that I want to say is, the idea that for the victims of families of enforced disappearance or whether it's torture, detention and so on, the hope is there. It seems to me that, it's the need for justice that drives the hope, right? So at some point there will be. And I think with Frederiek, you're saying, I think what was interesting when you're talking about legal revolutions, legal revolutions are also about hope, right? That it's not that what is the status quo now is not going to remain the status quo. That's right. Things are predictable, we never know when you get an opportunity. The ICTY happened in that small window of opportunity. So I think taking both of these together, you can see that the victim families, they're saying, we're documenting, there is hope. And then you have, it is our responsibility, apart from lawyers and lawyer networks and so on. I think every one of us, it's our political responsibility, ethical responsibility, legal responsibility to drive those mechanisms of change. And so we'll end on that note. Thank you very much to both of us.
Thank you. We have next session with Lord Nazir Ahmed, who's here.